Hi everyone. Today we are going to be looking at the evidence for evolution. How do we know how evolution occurred? Which species are more related to which other species? That's what we'll be looking at. One of the things you'll find is that this evidence comes from a variety of scientific disciplines. So we're going to break it down into 5 categories. We'll start off with the fossil record, showing us how species have changed over time. Then we'll look at the anatomical record, anatomy. We can compare body structures. We will look at embryology, how organisms' embryos change, gives us evidence of evolution. We'll look at the molecular record, which is basically DNA sequences, protein sequences. This is some powerful evidence for evolution that Darwin never had access to. And last, we'll look at biogeography, basically where organisms live and how they've moved and developed, also provides evidence of evolution. Starting off with fossils. Fossils are remnants of organisms. Usually it's not their bodies. For example, or we might sometimes find bones or teeth or actual body parts, but often a fossil is an impression of an organism's body left behind in rock or some other medium. So, for example, here we have a trilobite fossil. These were marine arthropods that lived for hundreds of millions of years but are now extinct, and we know about them exclusively through their many fossils they left behind. As I mentioned, we often find fossils in rock, though you can sometimes find them in other things like ice or tar pits. And these rock layers are laid down over time. So older layers are deeper, newer layers are higher up. So this gives us some way to gauge the age of a fossil. So here we are looking at these layers of rock. These layers have a specific name. They're called strata. So we got multiple strata here. And so if you have fossils in a lower strata, you can be pretty confident that they lived longer ago than fossils in a higher up strata. We can use radioactive dating to get more specific ages for these rocks, like 495 million years ago. They can get those dates through radioactive decay. In some places on Earth, like the Grand Canyon, you can even see the separation between different periods in Earth's history. So, for example, here you can see the Cambrian, the Devonian, Mississippian, etc. If you find a fossil in rocks here, you can be pretty confident that that organism lived in the Cambrian period. Fossils can tell us a lot about Earth and about life. One thing they tell us, the Earth is old, really old, about 4.5 billion years old, and life started around 3.6, 3.7 billion years ago, so life is extremely old too. And then life has changed. We find fossils of organisms that do not exist now, and some look very different than modern species, but some you can see very similar structures, and you can see sort of the story of evolution over the last few billion years. A specific type of fossil I want to mention is called a transitional fossil. As its name implies, it shows you the link between um, modern groups of organisms. So, for example, Archaeopteryx is a famous transitional fossil, showing us the link between non-avian dinosaurs, or dinosaurs that are not birds, and modern birds. Some people classify Archaeopteryx as the first bird. We're not 100% sure about that. But we do know multiple other dinosaurs had feathers. We found a lot of dinosaur fossils with feathers. But Archaeopteryx was a pretty surprising find when we found it. And now we can see some of the similarities between those reptilian dinosaurs and modern birds. Sometimes you will hear people say the fossil record's not complete, and that means a couple things. One is that not all organisms make fossils. If you're an organism that doesn't have a lot of hard body parts, it's not as easy to make a fossil, like if you're a jellyfish, for example. And also, we haven't found all the fossils. We find more all the time, but we're certainly not going to ever find them all. But the more we find, the more we learn about life's past. Now, if you saw this structure, you might look at this foot and say, okay, it's got um, claws. It's got scales. Could be some sort of dinosaur. But really, this is an emu's foot. An emu is a large flightless bird, and sometimes we don't see the similarities between maybe dinosaurs and birds. But when you think about it, dinosaurs and birds, or reptiles and birds, they have scales. Okay, you can see the scales covering its foot. Okay, talons, common in reptiles and birds. Um, and now we know lots of dinosaurs had feathers. So there's many similarities that you can see. Here's our emu friend. You got to be careful about these guys, though. They can be kind of aggressive. Another really famous transitional fossil is Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik is one of the possible links between fish and amphibians. This is a transition we're really interested in. How did life move, or not life, how did animals move from the ocean to land? You can see Tiktaalik here has some qualities of a fish, has scales, has flippers, but also has some characteristics of an amphibian. Has the eyes on top of its head instead of on the side like fish do. And its fins have been adapted so it can sort of push itself up and walk along a bit. Tiktaalik was only discovered a few decades ago, and it's still showing us a lot about evolutionary history. So again, these transitional fossils show us sometimes the links between groups, that it's not always easy to see the link, but once we find the fossils, we can learn more about how these transitions happened. So if you look at this fossil, this is Pakicetus, who lived 52 million years ago. What I want you to do is think to yourself, what do you think the modern descendant of this organism is? So take a look at Pakicetus here and then think to yourself, what do I think this may have led to in the current day? Right? So get an idea in your head. So 52 million years ago we got Pakicetus. Right? 50 million years ago we have this Ambulocetus natans, and you can see some changes from Pakicetus. Right? So now if you need to revise your idea, go ahead. What do you think is the modern descendant here? And then 40 million years ago we have Dorudon. So again, more changes. Right? Last chance to change your idea. What do you think the modern ancestor is, or modern descendant is? And these fossils actually show us some of the evolutionary past of sperm whales. Sperm whales, along with all whales and dolphins, evolved from these land-walking ancestors. Unlike other marine organisms that always evolved from ocean-going creatures, whales and dolphins' ancestors came out of the water, and then their later ancestors returned to the water. And you can still see some of the evidence of that. They have these hip bones, despite the fact they don't really have hips, but that's because they evolved from land-walking ancestors. We have tons of fossils of hominids. These are groups closely related to us, Homo sapiens, and we've learned a lot about our evolutionary past, especially in the last 20, 30 years. We found a lot more fossils. And these fossils allow us to make recreations, for example, of Neanderthals, which are a very, very close relative of us, Homo sapiens. Alright, let's move to the next category here, the anatomical record, or anatomy. So here we can see sometimes animals look very different on surface, but when you look underneath, you find stark similarities. Right? So, for example, here we got the forelimb of humans, cats, whales, and bats. And we've color-coded the bones, and you can see how similar these bone structures are. Even in a whale's flipper, which is quite a bit of a different structure than a human's arm, you can see how they have the similar bone structure that's been modified for a different structure. Okay, but they still have remnants of a wrist bone, despite the fact they don't have a wrist. Okay. Here you can see me circling these similar bones. Okay? And the question that brings up the question: why would these animals that have very different uses of these limbs have such similar bone structure? And the answer is evolution. These are homologous structures. They got all of these structures from a common ancestor, and it has been modified over time. So they don't recreate an entirely new structure from scratch just because of a change in body habits. They modify what is already there. So all of these mammals come from a mammalian ancestor that had this bone structure, and it has been modified, but you can still see how similar it is. So homologous structures are ones that are similar in structure, right? They have similar bones. They can be different in function, do a different job, but they are evidence of common ancestry because they got these structures from a common ancestor. Conversely, analogous structures are when you have different anatomy but the same function. So these are not evidence of common ancestry. So think about like birds and bugs. Okay, they both have wings. Wings are for flying. However, these have very different anatomy. Okay, no bones in these wings. Okay, they didn't get these wings from a common ancestor. Flight has evolved multiple times in Earth's history. So it's not that birds and insects are closely related because they both have wings. These are analogous structures. They are not evidence of common ancestry. Okay? It's like solving a problem with the same solution. Problem of flight solved with wings. Doesn't mean you got the wings from the same ancestor. Another good example of this, dolphins and aquatic mammals and fish. Okay? Dolphins and fish, they got that same streamlined shape. Helps for cutting through the water quickly, but they didn't get that shape from a common ancestor. They got it because they adapted to the problem of moving through the water with the same solution. So dolphins, of course, are much more closely related to us than they are to fish. Another piece of evidence for evolution, a really powerful piece of evidence, are vestigial structures. These structures are remnants of structures that had a function in an ancestor but may no longer have a function, or their function can be dramatically reduced. For example, ostriches' wings. These wings cannot let them fly. Ostriches cannot fly. They have wings because they evolved from an ancestor that had wings and used them to fly. And over time, as the ostrich's body changed, the wings don't just disappear, and they still can serve some purpose, like with balance and fighting off predators, but they certainly don't serve their original purpose of flight. There's a lot of interesting vestigial structures. I mentioned whales having these leg and pelvic bones, even though they don't have any more back legs. That's because they evolved from land-walking ancestors, and so that's the only reason they would have those. In humans, we have a tailbone. That is because we evolved from an ancestor with a tail, and that was the attachment point for the tail. Now that we have lost the tail, along with our other ape relatives, chimps don't have a tail and gorillas don't have a tail, that structure is no longer very useful. Other ones, cavefish, have eyes, despite the fact they live in caves that are completely dark and eyes won't serve any purpose. But they evolved from an ancestor that had eyes and used them, and over time their eyes may have gotten pretty bad, but it doesn't matter, they still are there because they evolved from an ancestor with eyes. A funny one is goosebumps in us. You get goosebumps when you're cold and all your hair stands up. And that is useful if you have lots of body hair, like if you're a cat and all your hair stands up, that will warm you up, it'll trap more heat. We have lost so much body hair though, goosebumps are basically useless. This little amount of hair isn't going to trap any extra heat. But we still have those because we evolved from an ancestor that was covered in hair. More examples, wisdom teeth, which used to fit more easily in our bigger jaws, but humans got smaller jaws over time, and now wisdom teeth often don't fit. and ear muscles in humans. Most humans can't move their ears purposefully under control. Some people can, and that's because we evolved from an ancestor that could move their ears. Many mammals can move their ears, um, but those muscles have become basically useless in most humans. Uh, Last one I think I'll mention here is the nictitating membrane. So this is like a third eyelid. A lot of birds have it, and some other mammals have it, or like a partial one. It can cover the eye from side to side. So here's an example. Here's a bald eagle. You can see the nictitating membranes partially covering. Uh, we don't have a third eyelid, but we have the remnants of a third eyelid. This little membrane here, the inside part of your eye. Okay? This comes from an ancestor that had a third eyelid, and we still have the remains of that. So that's a vestigial structure as well. All right, so comparative anatomy. Comparative embryology. We just did anatomy. Embryology is how young organisms develop, and it can show us these similar structures during development. Uh, so, for example, here we've got a fish, reptile, bird, and human embryo, and this blue structure we have highlighted. Um, this is what's called a gill pouch, and in fish it becomes the gills. And all vertebrates have this at one point in development, and all vertebrates have a tail at one point in development, including us, because all vertebrates probably evolved from an ancestor with a tail. And so some vertebrates lose the tail, and some vertebrates keep the tail. Another way embryology helps is you can see similarities even when the adult body form covers them up. So, for example, crabs and barnacles. As adults, they look really different, very different body plans. But as larvae, they both look very similar. Basically, they both look like this. And that's because they are very closely related. Despite the fact that their adult forms look different, the embryological form can show you true similarities. Okay, there's just more comparisons of embryos. Alright, I'm going to move on to the last two here. The molecular record, or DNA evidence. We can see DNA and protein structure similarities to see how closely species are related. For example, all species on Earth use the same genetic code. This is strong evidence that all life on Earth is related. It comes from a common origin. And we can compare different genes to see similarities and differences. So this is showing you how many amino acids are different from human hemoglobin, the protein in blood that helps carry oxygen. So, for example, this macaque has 8 differences because it's closely related, so that's not very many differences, whereas a dog has 32, a bird has 45, frog has 67, and a lamprey has 125 differences. So, in other words, their protein is quite a bit different than ours because our common ancestor with them lived a long time ago. Now, if you look at this image, it looks odd because normal karyotypes only have 2 chromosomes per each chromosome number. Like chromosome 1, you have 2 copies of chromosome 1, and that's because this isn't a normal karyotype. Here they are comparing 4 species. They lined up 4 species next to each other. So we've got a human, a chimp, a gorilla, and an orangutan all lined up. And you can see how similar these chromosomes are. You can also see in chromosome 2, these species all have an extra chromosome, one more than us. But you can see our chromosome 2 is just 2 chromosomes that fused together at one point. It even looks like 2 that stuck together. Okay? But you can see how similar these chromosomes are, showing how closely related to these other apes we are. Okay? This is showing DNA similarity. Whoops, let me go back. For example, 90 to 93% of our DNA is shared with chimps, 85 to 88% in common with mice. And you can see as you go farther down on this chain, you get things that we are less and less related to, like yeast and grapes. Last one I'm going to talk about is biogeography. This is basically where species live, so geography and bio, life, and where things live. Um, so, for example, what we find is island species most closely resemble the nearest mainland species. So, like species in Madagascar are most similar to species in Africa. Species in the Galapagos, where Darwin went, are most similar to species in South America. Even though it's far away, it's the closest mainland. So you might expect to see, like, if you look at a tropical place in one part of the world and a tropical place in another part of the world, you might think they'll have similar species. But really, what you find is the tropical place in the new part of the world is probably just going to have similar species to even temperate parts of the world in the same area, because that's how species get there. Okay, they move. So just because two places in the world are tropical doesn't mean you're going to see similar species there, especially if they're separated by a long distance, because it would be hard for species to move there. Right? Last thing here, sort of combining fossils and biogeography. Uh, we can see evidence for where organisms lived back when the continents were in different positions. So we have evidence of these, like Mesosaurus fossils in southern South America and southern Africa, which doesn't make sense given the modern placement of continents. But given that these were once together, it does make sense that these fossils would be bridging this area, because at one point they didn't need a bridge. So there we've gone through 5 areas of evolution, all things supporting how life has changed over time and the relatedness of species.